The midnight shift on Route 317 was always quiet. The city had long since settled into sleep, and only the occasional night worker, drifter, or insomniac ever boarded this late. For Ethan Graves, a 52-year-old veteran bus driver, it was routine. He had been driving the same Phoenix, Arizona route for 10 years, and every night felt the same. But tonight, something was off. At 12:36 a.m., Ethan pulled up to a lonely bus stop on the outskirts of town. The stop was barely lit, sitting beneath a single flickering street lamp. A woman in a pale blue dress stood motionless at the curb. Her arms hung stiffly at her sides, and she clutched a small leather notebook like it held some terrible secret. Ethan felt an odd chill. This stretch of road rarely had passengers. The nearest building was a mile away, and most people avoided this area at night. Still, it wasn't his job to ask questions. With a hiss, the bus doors opened. The woman stepped inside without a word. Her skin looked pale, almost too pale, under the bus's fluorescent lights. She didn't pay, didn't acknowledge him. She just walked straight to the very back seat, sat down, and stared out the window. The ride continued in silence. The city lights blurred past, and one by one, the other passengers got off. By 1:12 a.m., the bus was empty, except for her. Ethan checked the mirror. She hadn't moved. Then, at 1:17 a.m., the onboard radio crackled to life. Static. Then a garbled voice, barely understandable. 317. "Don't stop, keep driving." Ethan frowned, reaching for the radio. "Repeat that? Who is this?" No response, just static. Unease crawled up his spine. He glanced back at the rearview mirror. The woman was gone. The seat was empty, but the bus doors had never opened. The bus had never stopped. A sharp breath caught in Ethan's throat. His hands tightened on the wheel. Then he saw it. On the fogged back window, written in shaky letters from the inside. "Help me." And beneath it, a date. April 14th, 1998 a.m. Exactly 26 years ago. Ethan's blood ran cold. Then, from behind him, came a whisper. "You missed my stop." Ethan Graves gripped the steering wheel, his pulse pounding in his ears. The words on the fogged-up back window, "Help me, April 14, 1998, were burned into his mind. But as he turned in his seat, the window was clear. The message was gone. He rubbed his eyes. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a smudge, something explainable. Yeah, that had to be it. But then the whisper. "You missed my stop." The voice was right behind him, a woman's voice, soft, breathless, too close. Ethan froze, every hair on his neck standing up. He was alone. Wasn't he? He turned his head slowly. The bus was empty. Nothing. No passengers, no movement, just the low hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights. His throat went dry. Gripping the wheel, Ethan pulled the bus over to the side of the deserted road. He needed a moment to think. Then something shifted in the mirror. The woman in blue was back. She was sitting exactly where she had been before, staring out the window as if she had never left. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He turned to look with his own eyes. The seat was empty. But in the mirror, she was still there. He slammed the overhead lights on, illuminating the whole bus. His eyes darted from the mirror to the seat, still empty. This wasn't possible. Was he losing his mind? Then, a rustling sound. Something dropped onto the floor near the back of the bus. A small, leather-bound notebook. Ethan's heart hammered as he stood up and walked toward it, every step heavy with hesitation. He bent down, fingers shaking, and picked it up. The cover was old, worn, the edges curled with time. The initials LM were etched onto the front. Ethan Graves stood frozen, the small leather notebook trembling in his hands. "My name is Lillian Marsh. I went missing on April 14th, 1998, and I never left this bus." His breath came in short, uneven bursts. Lillian Marsh. He knew that name. He had heard it before. Somewhere. Then it hit him. 26 years ago, a 19-year-old college student had vanished without a trace. Lillian Marsh had been last seen boarding a city bus late at night. A bus on this very route. No body was ever found. No leads. Just a cold case that faded into obscurity. Ethan's throat went dry. This couldn't be real. He was tired, probably seeing things. His mind was playing tricks on him. Right? Then the lights flickered. A low, humming static filled the air like an old TV set struggling to find a signal. Ethan whirled around. The woman in blue was sitting in the back again. But this time she was facing him. Her dark eyes locked onto his, unblinking. Distant. Hollow. Ethan's stomach twisted. "Lillian?" he whispered. His own voice shook. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. The air around her seemed wrong, heavy, like the space itself was warping. Then the bus engine sputtered. The lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He reached blindly for his phone, fumbling for the flashlight. A single cold breath ghosted against his ear. "You have to find me." The lights blasted back on. Ethan stumbled backward, gasping. The woman was gone. Only the notebook remained, open on the seat where she had been. A new message was scribbled beneath the first, the ink still wet. "Find my last stop, please." Ethan's hands shook. He had spent 10 years driving this route, picking up strangers and dropping them off without a second thought. But now, one of them had never left. And somehow, after all these years, she was still waiting to go home. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts. But tonight, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. Ethan Graves sat frozen in the driver's seat, his fingers gripping the leather notebook so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Find my last stop, please." The ink was still wet. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't fatigue messing with his head. Something unnatural was happening on his bus. With a shaking hand, he reached for the radio. Maybe dispatch could tell him something. Maybe someone could talk him down. He pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is bus 317. I need..." Static. "You're on the wrong route." The voice wasn't dispatch. It was hers. Ethan's entire body went cold. A sharp screech suddenly filled the cabin, the sound of brakes grinding against metal. The bus lurched forward as if something had grabbed hold of it. Ethan slammed his foot on the brake, skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty road. The overhead lights flickered, casting brief flashes of the interior. In one flash, the bus was empty. In the next, Lillian Marsh sat in the back row, her face deathly pale. Her eyes were wide, hollow, as if she had seen something no one else could. And then Ethan noticed something else. For the first time since she had boarded, she wasn't wearing the blue dress. She was in a blood-stained college sweatshirt. And there was a handprint, dark, smeared and old, on the window beside her. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He yanked the gear into drive, gripping the wheel. "Okay," he whispered, mostly to himself. "Okay, your last stop. I'll take you there." The bus groaned forward. But when he checked the route map, something wasn't right. There was no record of any stops beyond this point. No roads, no houses, nothing. Ethan swallowed. He had been driving this route for years, and yet the road ahead seemed to go on forever. Somewhere in the back of the bus, Lillian whispered something. But when Ethan turned around, she was gone. Only her reflection remained in the back window, watching him. Waiting. Ethan Graves drove in silence, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The road ahead stretched into black nothingness, swallowed by thick fog that had no business being in the Arizona desert. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he couldn't. Not when she was still here. Lillian Marsh. "Find my last stop." Her words echoed in his mind, lodged deep like a splinter. Ethan checked the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty, but her reflection wasn't. She sat there, still as a statue, watching him with those hollow eyes. The blood stain on her sweatshirt had spread, dark and wet-looking, as if she had just been hurt. A chill ran through Ethan's spine. How did she die? What happened that night in 1998? The headlights barely pierced through the fog. The bus's GPS screen flickered, struggling to load a location. Then, off-mount detect. A sharp static burst through the radio. Then, a new voice, a man's voice. Turn back. Ethan's stomach twisted. Who is this? He demanded. No answer, just static, then the same voice again, this time urgent, angry. Turn back now. Ethan's breath hitched. This wasn't dispatch? And then the bus shuddered. The engine coughed, struggling, as if something was pulling it down. And in the mirror, Lillian's mouth moved. But she wasn't whispering this time. She was screaming. No sound came from her, but Ethan could see the terror in her face. She pointed wildly at something behind him. His stomach dropped. Slowly, he turned. There, standing in the aisle of the bus, was a man. His face was wrong, blurred, distorted, like he didn't belong in this world, like he was never supposed to be seen. Ethan's body locked up in pure fear. The man stepped forward. The bus lights flickered wildly, the fog thickening around them. Lillian's reflection, her mouth still wide in a silent scream, was the last thing Ethan saw before the lights went out completely. The bus lights died. Ethan Graves sat in complete darkness, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The bus wasn't moving anymore. And that man, the one with the blurred, distorted face, stood in the aisle, his body shifting unnaturally like a glitching video. Ethan couldn't breathe. Then, the notebook on the floor flipped open on its own, pages rustling violently as if caught in a storm. The ink on the latest page began to bleed, forming shaky, desperate words. He took me. Ethan's blood ran cold. The shadowy man lunged forward. Ethan threw himself back, crashing into the driver's seat, but the man didn't touch him. Instead, he moved toward the back of the bus, his presence making the air thick and suffocating. Lillian's reflection in the rearview mirror was sobbing now, her lips forming words Ethan couldn't hear. But suddenly, he understood. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was a crime. Lillian Marsh had never just vanished. Someone had taken her, killed her. And now, after all these years, her killer was here too. Ethan gritted his teeth and did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the gear shift and floored it. The bus roared to life, tires screeching against the road. The shadowy man twisted unnaturally, reaching, clawing, but as the bus lunged forward, his body began to fade. The fog peeled away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Lillian's reflection looked at him one last time, and she smiled, and then she was gone. The bus jolted violently, as if something had released it from a grip. And suddenly, Ethan was back on the main road. No fog, no shadowy man, no ghostly woman in blue. Just the empty city streets of Phoenix, Arizona. The old leather notebook still sat on the dashboard. Only one new message had been written. Thank you. Ethan let out a shaky breath. For the first time in 10 years, he skipped the rest of his shift. Because somewhere out there, Lillian Marsh's body was still waiting to be found. And now, after all these years, someone finally knew where to look.